The views expressed on this podcast are Peter Dekom's opinions based on his legal experience, research, and academic work. The podcast does not offer legal advice. For any legal matters, always consult an independent attorney who can assess your specific situation. And now, on with the show.
Hi there, everybody. It's Peter Dekom again, and I'm engaging in a very self-indulgent moment here. Normally, I spend 10 hours preparing every hour of podcast I have. Today I spent nothing because I have an interviewer here, a prominent attorney who has known me a few years. I'm going to hand it over to questioning and everything else to Amanda Fleming.
Hi.
Hey, what happened? Where's your lipstick? Just kidding.
I forgot my lipstick today. I did not know it was going to be on camera, but that doesn't matter.
It doesn't.
The important thing is that I get to sit here with Peter Dekom.
Oh my God.
So I would like to start by first saying thank you because there is a lot that we can all learn from you. This episode is about your career and your approach to negotiation. So from the micro negotiations that you have inside your internal self to the more macro level negotiations that you have as a prominent entertainment attorney in Hollywood, to even more macro level negotiations on global issues. I can't wait to hear about it. So let's get started.
You don't want to know about my first negotiations?
Sure.
I was 13 years old. We let my stepfather and married my mom, and he's with the U.S. Foreign Service, and we were posted to Beirut. So after a very barfy trip across the North Atlantic in the dead of winter, which I had no stabilizer at all, I had barfed myself into oblivion. We finally arrived after stop off in Cadiz and Marseille and Naples. We finally wound up in Beirut, Lebanon. And I'm listening and I hear the muezzin calling the faithful to prayer. Since I wasn't a faithful praying, I didn't count. But it was a very interesting. You knew you were someplace you'd never been before. And my mother informed me that you bargain for everything in this country. I said, oh, okay. I didn't know what that meant, but I said, what the hell, I can do that, I thought. And I will also note that, one of the things Americans do that is very detrimental to both travel and negotiation is the assumption that the laws and rules that apply in the United States have any remote validity in another country. And I was lucky because Lebanon had been basically a French protectorate until 1943. So there was a Western cultural element to it. Anyway, I had to go get my hair cut. So I went to the neighborhood barber. And I went in, I got my haircut. There was a fixed price for haircuts. And then I had to buy some hair tonic. Yes, in those days, we actually used that crap. So I started negotiating. It was basically 6 pounds Lebanese, which is probably about a buck and a half back then. So today it would probably be about $5 or $6. And I looked at that and I said, no, I can't pay that price. So I started negotiating. I offered him half price. And this went on for 3 hours, back and forth, back and forth. It was entertainment for him, and I was having fun too. But I remember the words, they echo in my mind as if it were yesterday, is $4.75, shut up. And I will never forget that. That was my first negotiation, and I wound up paying $4.75 for the hair tonic, which I probably didn't actually want. But having spent 3 hours of this poor guy's time, he earned it. So that was my first negotiation many, many millennia ago. And my mom actually told me that they're on a metric system, and she talked about the metric system. I said to her very naively while I was on the boat, do they use hours and minutes too? Okay, start.
So starting from your $4.75 haircut.
No, that was the hair tonic.
Hair what? Oh, hair tonic. What guiding principles have helped you through high stakes negotiations, complex negotiations, or even the most mundane ones? What principles do you adhere to?
There's no one rule fits all, but there's certain things that everybody negotiates everything. We're either in the business of buying, selling, or being slave-like laborers. So anytime you present something to somebody else and you want a response from them, you're selling. And sometimes they're selling to you, and sometimes it goes back and forth. The reality is this is so fundamental, but people don't even think about this. Before you start any negotiation whatsoever, you have to have a strategy. And I know that sounds kind of abstract, but what strategy means, you know what you want. You know what the other side probably wants. You know who they are, who's their representative, what is the company, what have they done before, how much can you find out? Now you have the internet to do searches. You have no excuse not to understand exactly who the human being you're negotiating with it might be and whom that human being represents, whether as an attorney or an executive. Who are they? And then you need to understand the parameters of the kinds of deals they've made. If you don't know what those parameters are, you might call some people who have done business with them before. You need to have some knowledge. That said, over preparation can really screw you up. When I first was a young, sparky lawyer, a year or two out of law school, I over-prepared. I had everything locked in. I had every possible contingency. And the funny thing about that is if you start negotiating or talking based upon that, and they change one variable, they throw out the whole thing that you just did. You also have to deal, if you're representing somebody else, a client is a topic that I would have to say is there. Almost all clients believe, I want this, go get this. And I always tell them, unless you've dealt with someone repeatedly so that you guys can finish each other's sentences or whatever it is, or the price is so clearly established that someone will use an AK-47 to shoot you if you vary from the fundamentals. I mean, there are certain talent in the world. You know what Steven Spielberg's deal was, et cetera. But rule one to clients is there's no road from A to B. Huh? No road from A to B. What the hell does that mean? If you want something and you ask for it, you won't get it. There's also another thing that I find is you try to find agreement on as many levels as you possibly can. So never start with specifics. Always start with a more abstract. Do you want to make a deal about this? That's a very abstract. Do you want, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to use it? What's the budget of what you're going to make or whatever you're going to do? And to understand that what you're trying to do subconsciously or consciously is to evolve a transaction with the person on the other side of the negotiation. So let's start with that premise and take a look at how you do that. I got to tell a story here. Okay. This is before the internet was ubiquitous or before it was. I was a young lawyer, and I was representing a completed theatrical motion picture, and there was a distributor that wanted to distribute that completed motion picture, and that distributor was represented by a Wall Street white shoe firm in Manhattan. So my client said, okay, I want you to go to New York. I'll pay for the trip. I did well in that. I'll pay for the trip, but I want you to be face-to-face with the lawyers on the other side. I said, well, can't this be done by phone? No, we want you there in person. I'll have more of an impact. I said, okay. So they didn't know who I was, except that I was from California and I was young. They had no idea that I graduated first in my law school class. They had no idea that I was an Ivy League graduate. None of this stuff. And I love being underestimated. So exciting. It just makes me so tingly. So basically, I went to Macy's and bought a piece of clothing I would never wear ever again, but I was catering to the expectations of the dumbass, arrogant elitists in New York. And I was pretty sure that whoever was going to be sitting at the negotiating table, I would be equally educated, maybe not as experienced, but something else I learned about law firms, unless someone's a specialist in your area of practice as a lawyer, motion pictures and television was my practice at the time. If you have a general corporate lawyer representing the other side, and you know your business backwards and forwards, the last thing you want the other side to know is you know your business backwards and forwards. So what did I buy at Macy's? Oh, yes, it was made of polyester. It was a leisure suit, and it was powder blue. I wouldn't be caught dead in that thing anywhere in California, even back then. There was no excuse for that, nothing. So I packed it away secretly in my bags and wouldn't open it until I knew I was going to have that appointment the next day. And I'm in my room. I put this thing on. I look at it. I feel like doing, John Travolta point up and down from Saturday Night Fever. And I just said, okay, I'm going to go like this. And I'm feeling fairly self-conscious, especially when I'm wearing a powder blue leisure suit and carrying a briefcase. Okay, I didn't have a powder blue briefcase. I had one of the regular kinds made of dead cow. So I went to this building and I walked in, and I had to get in character. By the way, I had studied acting at UCLA Film School and Theater Arts Department. Got a very good grade, I might add. So I went into this building and I assumed the position, which is basically mouth agape like a tourist, looking, eyes darting around, taking in the scene and pretending to be intimidated. So I walked in, even before I got into the law firm, which took up several floors on Park Avenue. So you get an idea the level of the firm I was going into. I tend not to be particularly intimidated in most circumstances. Usually to intimidate me, you better be armed and pointing it at me. But okay, so I go in and I check in with the receptionist and she sends me down to a conference room. So I sit down at one side of the table, and about 5 minutes later, a partner, a junior partner, and two associates tromp into the conference room, and they sit opposite me. So a little old me in a powder blue leisure suit, looking around, mouth agape, and pretending to be intimidated. I mean, I had walked down the paneled hallways with the painted pictures of the partners in the firm, the famous ones. Anyway, I'm sitting there, and I sort of say, I'm not sure why I'm here. We could have done this just as easily by phone. Anyway, they're taking in my powder blue leisure suit, and I'm confirming their worst assumptions about people from California. I was a dumbass. They were to eat my liver. Okay, I'm ready for this liver beat guard. Okay, so we start talking, and I sort of say, I'm not sure why my client sent me here. I'm not even sure what I could do. What they offered was something called a net profits deal. You probably heard of those, and they're not good. Sort of like eating bad, digested, spiky food. Okay. So I basically said, I'm not sure, but what they offered was money comes in from the theaters. They take a big, fat, juicy distribution fee, and then they recoup any advance they've got and all their costs, all their marketing costs. But they didn't advance anything, so the only thing that they were going to deduct was marketing costs and a distribution fee. So I'm thinking to myself, the most expensive part of a lot of motion picture distribution structures is marketing. And in those days, paying for prints. Some by prints will come, but those didn't. Okay, so I'm thinking to myself, they don't know what distribution costs are probably, what constitutes distribution costs. So I basically took a deal with a lot of barriers between money coming in and money going to my clients. And my goal was to have not so much deducted from that and for as much pure money to flow directly to my clients, which means I either had to reduce the distribution fee or reduce the distribution costs. I decided to concentrate on the distribution costs. So I said, well, what are distribution costs? And they sort of like looked around the room like they didn't really know. I said, well, let's take certain minimal costs, residuals, sales taxes, dues and assessments. I listed a few things out there, which represented approximately 15% of all marketing costs. And I said, okay, so you take off a distribution fee. I assume we could drop it a little bit. And they did. And then you deduct these costs. And I enumerated what they were. And then my client gets the rest because we paid the production costs. So we take that and move. The difference between those five off the tops and distribution costs, generally speaking, distribution costs can almost equal what it costs to produce the movie. So if I'm deducting that much, the likelihood of my client seeing any money is very minimal. And so what happened was you take these minor costs, which are basically 15% of what the actual costs are, and we get the rest with a reduced distribution fee. And in those days, we had a marvelous new technology called facsimiles. There is a place in the world where they still use faxes in Japan for lunch orders. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So we actually made the changes in that room. They faxed the papers back to my clients back in La La Land, and the document was signed and the deal was closed. I turned what was basically a net profits deal into an adjusted first dollar gross deal, and my clients made out like bandits. The next time I was with the same lawyers, we represented a mutual client, and I was wearing at that time, I actually wore suits. I was a rebel in my law firm. Nobody wore suits in my law firm except me. I wore them. And then I'm sitting on the same side of the table with this other law firm, and our mutual client was Jim Henson. So as we go through the world, they learned the hard way because they saw the numbers. The clients got their deal. They thought they made a decent deal. They could have done much better. They didn't. And that's okay with me. You know, if you don't know your stuff or if you pretend to know your stuff. I once had someone come into my office, highly pretentious office with padded walls, probably because I'm crazy, but also, antiques, really expensive paintings. It's a ridiculous, pretentious office. And you walk in, you have to walk a good ways to get to the desk. And this guy was shaking. I mean, a young lawyer, probably practicing no more than 4 or 5 years, and he's literally shaking. So I'm actually laughing to myself, and I'm looking at this guy. I said, so the situation is I'm representing a television production company hiring a sustained writer to be a part of the writing room on a television series. And so this young man comes in and I said, okay, so what would you like? What are you're here for? I would like to make the following changes in the proposed draft document that you sent to us. And I said, okay, what are the changes? He asked for 10 things. I looked at him and I said, okay. And he said, what do you mean, okay? I said yes to everything. And he looked at me with really puzzled look in his face. He said, oh, you thought you asked for 10 things and you get 5 back? That's not the way negotiation works. You could have asked for 10 things. I could have said no to all of them. But everything you asked for was relatively reasonable, didn't distort the nature of the transaction, and basically would have created a relationship. Remember, I'm dealing with someone hiring a writer to work for them. I want them to be in a positive environment and think well of each other. It's not like settling litigation where you hate each other and you put away the swords. This is a situation where you're constructing something and you want the result to be positive. He looked at me and I said, look, it isn't going in and splitting 50-50. That's not negotiation. That's not how it works. And you asked for things that were all reasonable. And I wanted you to be a hero. And I wanted your client to be happy working for my client. The relationship worked out quite well, I might add. I also had a movie star who came to me, very well-known movie star. I won't mention the name. And he didn't like his lawyer. They had a sort of a breaking up on a particular point. And I looked at his standard terms and conditions, and it had so many stupid ass things in it. It's like you've heard the stories. I only want green M&Ms. When you ask for stupid stuff, I had a feeling that this movie star, major player, didn't actually know what was in his contract. His lawyer just decided to make up a whole bunch of stuff to make it, show why he exists as a lawyer. So I said, let me read you something here. I'm going to read you your perks, your standard perk writer. And I read the perk writer and I said, tell me when you hear something that matters to you. I went through the entire perk list. He didn't say, I want any of these things. I said, okay, let me ask you a very strange question. On the last couple of movies that you've worked on, how were you treated by the other cast members and the crew? Were they friendly or would they just like back off the minute you talked? He said, it seemed a little cold to me. I said, well, if you had this list of perks handed out to the crew, how would you react? And he looked at me and said, what do you recommend? And I said, okay, I would recommend you have 2 secretaries. Your job for your secretaries and for you is to get the name of everybody in the cast and crew, whether they're married, when they got married, what's the date of their wedding anniversary, do they have children, how old, what are their birthdays, and you're going to basically hand sign cards. You're going to have little gifts for everybody on the cast and crew. It won't cost you much at all, but it shows you care. And he did that. And then he came back to my office like 4 months later. And I said, so how was the production? He said, I've never had such a good time in my life. I enjoyed every minute of it. So part of what you do as a negotiator, there's this factor which is almost illusory in most situations I've been in. It's called common sense. I don't know why they call it common sense, because it's really uncommon. But part of all this is understanding you're having a contract or negotiation. And I'm not talking about when you're trying to figure out how to bail out in a family law situation, although I have consulted for fairly famous people who are fighting over intellectual property values. But ultimately, part of what you're doing, a contract does two things. And then what most important thing is it manages expectations. Typically, if a relationship works and it's been set by a contract, you're really and truly never going to look at it again. People just get stuff done. The accounting department will follow the accounting procedures, and that's about it. The other part of a contract is to cover what happens when the shit hits the fan, when stuff goes wrong. You have to know how that's going to be resolved. I'm also very organized when I represent a client. I'm part of a negotiating team with famous people. They often have personal managers who normally run the show. And then there is the agent who gets the gig. And then there's the business manager who takes care of all your gambling debts. And then there's the lawyer. And typically I have been in almost no situations in my life where the agent is better qualified to negotiate the transaction than I am. And there's another variable. When you have a professional negotiator on your team, and that negotiator is constantly dealing with people on the other side, you have to be aware, and it's very important to keep this in mind, that part of that negotiator's mantra is to keep the relationship with the other side positive. And so they are more likely to give up things that you, playing the shit hook you could truly be, wouldn't give. So what you're basically doing, and what the other side often tries to do, is to find a member of that negotiating team that they can crack. Is it the client? Clients often just pick up the phone and start negotiating and giving away the store. Part of dealing with clients, say, look, when you do that, just throw up your hands and say, look, I don't do that. I have a lawyer and an agent to do that. So please don't bother me with this stuff. They're here for a reason. That's number one. Number two, if you know what your client's value proposition, what's their price, what's important to them, you can sit down there. And here's a very interesting reality for me as a practicing entertainment lawyer. Unless the studio knows what our deal is and they're not going to fight me, never wait for the studio to make you an offer. Ever. Choke yourself, slap yourself around.
That was going to be my question.
Well, it is interesting. And the reason is very simple. People who wait for the studio to make an offer, when I ask them, why do you do that? Oh, they might offer me more than I asked for. I look at them and say, that's going to happen when hell freezes over. It doesn't work that way. You want the negotiations to be in your yard with your rules. So what you have to do is sort of mush people into the place where you can make an offer. If you go in and somebody gives you a specific set of numbers, and send, here's what I want. All you're going to get is every one of those on the list is going to get negotiated. Because if you have specificity, it's too easy to say no to it. So what I try to say to people is, look, I want to have a crib sheet in advance where every single member of the negotiating team has a copy of that crib sheet. I want them to know what's on that. But I'm never going to give that to the other side. Ever. Even when I'm ready to document, I will adjust that document so it fits the deal. But what I want to have is, I don't want to be able to go around me or go around and try to do something else. So if they go and call up, let's say they call the manager or the agent, and the agent has the crib sheet, all they have to do is look at the crib sheet and say, well, no, that's what we want. And that way everyone's on the same page. And by getting that crib sheet to everybody in advance and getting their input, they feel part of the team because they can change the crib sheet. They can talk, no, I don't want that, I want this. That's okay. But ultimately, when you have your crib sheet, you don't ever hand it to the other side. You evolve each category as a separate negotiation. Well, what about this? What if we did this? How about that? And you also have to know that sometimes, because there's no road to A to B, you might have to go to A to D to F to G, and then maybe you get to B. Or maybe the deal is in an entirely different place. I've been in situations where I have very powerful clients, and fundamentally, I'm not sure I want cash fees because every movie they've ever done has made millions, or TV series, whatever it is. I want gross, first dollar gross. So maybe at some point, if I see a proclivity on the other side, and I'll give you an example of that in a second. Okay, let's not do the fee thing. How about this thing? And you say, well, what happens if they don't make the money? I say, well, okay, I want all the rights for free. There are all kinds of things you can do that you might just do on your own. But I'll give you an example. Sometimes the other side gives away their negotiating position. I represented some very, 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 very successful producing team at a major studio with a senior business affairs executive considered to be the dean of that area. Okay, I like that. I prefer always to negotiate with people who know what they're doing as opposed to getting free room board and tuition from me. I didn't need this with this particular individual, this business affairs executive. And my clients wanted to do a deal where the studio recoups its hard costs with no markups, and then whatever else is left coming in is split 60-40 or 50-50 between the studio and my clients. And I told my clients, I can probably get you a $1 gross deal. We'll make you more money than that. No, that's what we want. That's the deal we want. I said, oh, if you don't get that deal, do I have your permission to do, and I gave them an outline of what the $1 gross deal would look like. I said, okay. So what I was getting in my mind is my clients are assuming that this movie will be one of the top 5 movies of the year. And they don't believe that anything they make is going to generate less than that. And I go to the studio and the business affairs executive, and he says, what do you want? I outlined the deal, and he's insulted. He's outraged. And I'm happy he's doing that because what he's doing is what my clients did. And they're running high side numbers. I know that. So they don't mind doing something else. These high side numbers are like, you're not my co-venture. You're not another studio. You're just talent coming in to make a film. Why should I pay? I'd rather give you a $1 gross deal than pay you what you're asking for. The minute the business affairs executive said, I'll give you a $1 gross deal, he was toast. It was over. It was done. Because he was assuming that my producer clients would get a normal producer $1 gross, which is usually a small fee against, maybe 2.5% to 5% of gross. Actors at that time were getting 20% of $1 gross, escalating. So I said to the business affairs executive, can you tell me any actors at your studio in the last 10 or 15 years who've generated more money for your studio than my producer clients? And there was this pause. Dead. He was over, finished. So instead of getting a normal lowball producer $1 gross, I got an actor's $1 gross for producers. No one would ever get that. But he sort of put himself into that situation. And when he couldn't answer the question, name me any actors who've made more for your studio than my clients in their movies, and he couldn't give me a name, he was mine. And we made that deal with 20% going up to a lot more, $1 gross. And the movie opened, and it did not perform the way my clients had expected it to do. It did not perform in accordance with what the business affairs executive basically assumed was going to happen on one of their movies. It did okay. It did a little bit better than break even, but not much. And my clients made more money on that movie than anything they ever made in their history then or afterwards. So in the end of all of this stuff is an understanding how the business works. And my clients were ecstatically happy. I mean, there are also things that I tell people. If you're negotiating in a transaction where a lot of what you're doing is contingent on the future. And we live in a world of AI. We live in a world where we're substituting mechanisms for distribution. Who knew what streaming was 15, 20 years ago? Streaming meant going to catch fish in a pond or in a wavy water source. Not what we have today. And everyone says, wow, streaming's making so much money. I got news for everybody. Streaming has probably been one of the worst experiments in Hollywood's history. The only people making a lot of money from that are YouTube and Netflix. Everyone else is sitting there saying, well, I'm making lots of money. And if you look at companies like Disney that bought Fox for, $70 billion. And they said, well, that will give me lots of content for my streaming franchise. And there's a lot of interest. They happen to have bought Fox, and a lot of these mergers and acquisitions that you see take place in a period of rising interest rates. Interest is a very diabolical, mean-spirited character in most negotiations, because if you can get interest deducted and it's going up like crazy, and you have a markup on the interest, and in Hollywood, the typical market is 125% of prime. Prime is fine when it's 2%, 3%. But now it's almost 8%. So you're looking at that and you realize that 20% markup probably means you're going to be charging interest on things forever, and you're never going to hit break even. So interest becomes a very interesting factor, and also evolution of technology. I'll give you one example and tell you how old I am. I was in a situation where cable television rights were the premier aftermarket to theatrical motion pictures. Well, I hate to say this, but I looked at that and I started looking at the growth charts in new media like home video. And everyone's at home video, who wants that stuff? So we had a choice for one of my clients. I'll either give you a nice juicy piece of pay television after break even, or I'll give you a much bigger piece of home video. Which do you want? I pulled out my numbers. I love numbers. And by the way, get too specific with numbers, you get lost. What you need to do when you're running numbers is what's called fuzzy logic. Deal with orders of magnitude so you get an idea of what things are worth. Don't go into the weeds, because the weeds change. So I looked at all this stuff and I said, as I look at it, it's going to take 3 years for this motion picture to hit the marketplace and another year or two to generate money. So I can't assume that the numbers that are being generated today in pay television and in home video are remotely going to be the numbers that we're going to get money paid on in a couple of years. So I said, okay, so let's project out how much money it's going up every year, and see what point home video crosses the pay television line. And I figured, okay, that's about 2 years from now. So I picked home video. Everyone thought I was mentally ill. Well, I am mentally ill. I'm not going to deny that. But why would you do that? Here's cable. It's a sure thing. We know it's going to be there. And you're going to take a bet on home video. And I was thinking to myself, I'm not taking any bets at all. If I took K television, I would take a bet, because I would be assuming that a medium that is fading is going to sustain its value. Whereas this one that's coming up is coming up really fast. As it turned out, we made about 2 or 3 times more on the home video escalation than we would ever have made in pay television. So it's kind of have a feeling. I read, well, you can tell by my blogs, my podcasts, everything that I do, I'm an over fact sucking human being. I suck those facts any way I can. When interest rates go up, I actually, listen to what the Fed says. You heard my podcast on the Fed. And I ask myself, how does it affect my clients? How does it affect my life? What is the net result of this? And I'll give you another example on that. We had a television series that got a big fat advance, and it was about to earn out. It was about to hit break even and generate a lot of net positive cash flow to my clients. And I looked at the interest rates, and I looked at the way they calculated losses and profits, and I said, I don't think this is going to break even. So my clients were about to spend $40,000 or $50,000 in an audit. I said, don't waste your time. And we checked with the auditor, and the auditor said, don't waste your time. If you don't know how all these variables are, or let's say you're in a tariff war. I don't know how that could happen. What could ever happen in a tariff war? And somebody decides they want to punish Hollywood, or they want to punish the industry that your client's in. You got to figure out that those tariffs have to go into the calculation somewhere. And when you don't know what that somewhere is, you need to sit down and have a heart-to-heart talk with your client and say, look, what if this happens? What if that happens? How are you equipped to handle these changes? And I didn't used to look heavily at the political spectrum to determine what my deals look like. I do now. Also, when you have things in your country which are called culture wars, culture wars, at some point, people don't want your culture to be disseminated. And so they create barriers to your culture. Or other countries are looking at what you're doing to their culture and they decide to do it to your culture, you have to factor all the stuff in there. That's why it's common sense. You can't. I love people who basically deal with something they call precedent. Precedent is the deals that existed in the past determining what you're paid. So I remember talking to someone at Disney, someone actually a very intelligent business affairs executive. She was great. And I was making a deal with her, and she basically said, well, our precedent is, and she started telling me what it was. I started laughing. And she said, why are you laughing? I said, you just bought a $73 billion company that you're merging into your existing company. You don't have any precedents. You're starting over again. And there's this long pause. And I have to say, I got a lot of respect for her for the answer. She simply looked at me and said, you're right. Part of this is understanding that people tend to get into these pathways and they can't get out of them. They don't understand the world is changing and they don't take those changes into consideration. Whenever people say, well, that's standard, that's what we always do, I always like to respond, oh, that's great. You've given me all the things I need to change because I haven't made a standard deal in 40 years and I'm not starting now. And I said, so thank you for giving me the list of what's standard so I know what I'm going to change. And they look at me like, huh, what? I once I was making a deal at Fox, and it was it was sort of a hybrid pay feature situation. And I asked for a certain credit. I was representing a really major best-selling author. And the business affairs executive on the other side asked for a certain credit where his name would be presented in paid advertising, how big it was on the screen, where it was featured. Credit means a lot to clients in the entertainment business. It's their badge of success. People don't see their bank account, but they sure as hell see their credits. So I asked for something, and they basically said, no, we don't do that. We'll tie your credit to the screenwriters, where the union determines the nature of the credit. And I said, well, you know what? My client isn't a run-of-the-mill screenwriter. So this is what we're going to get. I said, no, you're not. I said, well, we have our precedents. And I looked at them and I said, I have my precedents and my client has his precedents, and we're not going to change those. So you go tell your senior management, you blew this deal over credit. And I said, by the way, what happens when you get like a J.K. Rowling's or a Stephen King in here making a deal? What do you do? I know what I have Stephen King's credits. You want to see them? I can send them to you. And they said, well, we don't have those deals. I said, I wonder why. Maybe you should rethink the deal making so you can get real big movies again. And we closed, and they did something which you also have to keep in mind. They said, we'll put it in a side letter. So in my world, when I'm dealing with studios, nothing is sacred. That doesn't mean I'm going to get it, but I absolutely know for a fact that they'll change anything if they want it badly enough. Do you have any weird questions for me? You better start thinking of, oh boy.
I have a practical question that I'm very curious about. When it comes to drafting, do you prefer to take control and draft the document, or do you prefer to see the other side's cards and let them draft it? Never.
Yeah, I always want to do it. And what I find interesting, this is a major movie with some real movie you would recognize. Unfortunately, attorney-client privilege prevents me from discussing the specifics, but you know the movie and you know the players in it. And basically what I did is I was dealing with a team of actor, writer, directors, et cetera, together, and I represented one of the team. And the lawyers on the other side are of the, okay, we'll wait to see what the studio sends and then we'll respond. That ain't PD. PD don't do that. So PD basically said, okay, I'm going to draft the deal and it will mention your clients by name, but I'm going to basically say I'm representing my client, who is the 10,000-pound gorilla in all this, and you're welcome to input in it. And if you don't input it in, I'm sending it out anyway. So look at it. So I send this like a 10-page deal memo with a lot of boilerplate specificity, but pretty tailored for high negotiation power. So they didn't say, well, we're going to wait till they come back. Well, they may give us something better than what you're asking for. Oh, where have I heard that before? So we sent it out, and like at this time, a lot of movies and productions would start before the contracts were finalized. And so we started doing all this stuff, and my client said, we're doing this. And the studio said, no, you're not. You never mentioned it. You never discussed it. So we're not going to give it to you now. And I said, look at page 5, paragraph 3, subparagraph A. We put it in there and you never objected to it. It saved the day for everybody on that team because I don't assume I'm going to get better than what I'm going to put in my deal memo. And if they want to negotiate it, they have the deal memo. Even if they say we're going to draft the document ourselves, they're going to use your form as the basic outline of what they're going to draft. So one way or the other, they're going to play in your yard. How's that for an answer?
It's great. I've always wondered that. I have another question. Have you ever found yourself in a position where you realized your client has zero leverage? And then in that situation, like if so, what do you do?
I pull out my Glock. No, come here, fire. Come on, Brutus, eat. The answer is, look, at some point, I actually made this argument once. I took on a young client and he offered me a back end that I found that is illusory. And I basically said, I don't do this. I want this kind of a back end definition. And they said, but your client's a first time director. And I said, I have such faith in that client that I took him on as my client. And you know, I would never, ever accept a deal of that definition. I just don't do that. You know what I do. You know my clients. So if I'm assuming this is a superstar and you could lose a superstar, why don't you just say yes? They did. Now that's a stupid reason, but sometimes for young lawyers and young negotiators taking on stuff, one of the things you learn is humor, laughing, knowing your people over lunch, and asking sometimes for them to help you, even if you are on the other side. That isn't stupid. When someone comes to me and they're a young lawyer and they don't know what they're doing and they ask for help, not one of those people have ever walked away with less than a good deal, ever. Because if you have the temerity and the confidence to ask questions, you know what? I got respect for that. You pretend like you know shit and I know you don't. It takes between 3 and 15 seconds for me to figure that out. Unless you're wearing a powder blue leisure suit. I absolutely understand that everyone has to start somewhere. And those of us who are senior in our professions, whatever industry we're in, basically what we're saying is, okay, we want to build a trusting relationship. By the way, if you say something and you pretend like you didn't say it, you die. Your reputation is toast. There are lawyers out there, they get on the other side of something, and I know they don't have, what I would call integrity. I either tell my clients, we're not going to make a deal with these people, or if we do, we're going to give them very firm parameters, and if they don't take them, we can tell them to screw off. Your reputation is sacred. And I remember there were a couple of very, very successful producers who had a bad habit of selling the same motion picture to 2 buyers inconsistently. And they wanted to hire me. They offered me a retainer for 5 years for $1 million a year. And I knew what they were doing is to buy my reputation. I passed. Your reputation is so valuable that even if you're pushed in a corner where your practice may die, you have one choice, and that's to make the right choice. And if you don't have that ethical backbone, you're not going to make it that long into the business anyway. The people who are the shysters, the nasties, whoever they are, they get the reputation, and everybody is ready for them. So you come to me with a bad reputation, or you did something untoward to me in the past, I promise you I'll get you.
You mentioned qualities like trust and integrity. I'd love to hear what you have to say about the concept of saving face, allowing other people to save face when that's appropriate, as opposed to playing more hardball.
Well, one of my basic premises, and I tell this to most people in negotiations, usually with my client's permission, I said, look, if some of these terms wind up being too onerous for you, come back. Let's talk. If you have a trusting relationship with the other side and they come back and you accommodate those issues, it goes a long way to show that you're real and you're into business with common sense. Common sense has to be cultivated, which sounds like an oxymoron, but you really have to work at what makes common sense. If you look at the other side and what you asked for and what you got in a contract is so onerous that it really impedes their ability to make money, or it might make your client look bad, or whatever it is, have an open mind. Because ultimately, most businesses, unless you're in the business of settling litigation, which is a different ball of wax, but I'm not a litigator, you basically are trying to build things. And building relationships, contracts to create a going forward relationship, to different mindset.
I'd like to ask a question about some nonverbal communication, specifically the handshake and eye contact. I'd love to hear what you have to say about either of those.
I tell people to basically study body language, and if necessary, project false body language. Like if I lean in like this, I'm violating your space and making you very uncomfortable. That made you uncomfortable when I zoomed into you. Also, when you're in a room and it's freezing cold in a room, don't assume that this means they're not going to communicate with you and they're protecting themselves. They might just be cold. So I'll give you one instance where humor panned out. I was dealing with the CEO of a major Hollywood studio and a real killer. And I made a deal for a television show where my client, superstar, had control of everything on that stage. What the furniture looked like, what the guests were, what the questions were, everything. And I went there and I noticed that the CEO was a serial micromanager, brilliant person and a wonderful, wonderful executive. But he started picking the fabric colors on my client's couch on set. So I said, hey, X, let's go have dinner. So we went out to dinner. I brought my briefcase. And about after the appetizer, somewhere, I pulled out a carpet and 4 fabric samples. I said, Mr. X, I just bought a new home. I don't want to change the carpeting in it. So I know you're really into this stuff. Here's the carpet and here are 4 curtain drape samples. You have any suggestion? It's sort of a modern, but not, it's contemporary more than it is modern. And he looked at me and he said, you think I'm micromanaging, don't you? I said, no. I think it's common for the CEO of a Fortune 100 company to pick fabric samples on the couch of somebody. And he looked at me and he said, point well taken. We got that one. So sometimes you got to figure out clever ways to make a point. And I used to, when you're dealing with difficult people and their assistants, by the way, the assistants are very important in all this. I would call up the assistant and say, what kind of mood is he or she in? If it's a bad mood, I reschedule the meeting. So there you go. All I can tell you is if you start doing this stuff, negotiation gets to be a trip. It's fun. And when the business changes, let you be the one that changes the business. Anything else before we cut this off?
Yeah, one final question. Is there anything that separates a good deal from a great deal in Hollywood? What is it? Numbers, relationships, or something else entirely?
Well, it depends on what your client wants. If they want total creative control and amazing credits, that's the priority. Okay. And maybe money is a little bit, you can sacrifice a little in money. What is the goal? What makes your client happy? And if it's everything, then you got to balance it out and work it out. If you don't have the bargaining position, you kind of have to vamp and find out from the other side what they care less about and go at least get that. But in all of this stuff, it's an understanding your own client and not going out to get just what you want.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, folks, this is too easy. I didn't have to prepare for it. Next time, I'm going to have to do some work. But I thank you, and I thank all you who are hanging in there. And all I can say is I am having fun, and I hope you're enjoying this too. Until next time, this is Peter Dekom saying goodbye.
If you would like to give feedback, suggestions for new topics, or have a question that might be selected for a future podcast, please email us at dekompodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. Until next time.